Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate our first thing that we're going to create. We are going to be creating a pizza that looks like this. Okay, so this is an original illustration entirely created in Photoshop. We can do something very similar in Photopea. And it's all made using the basic drawing tools that I showed you in the previous video, okay? Obviously, this has tons of detail. The textures look really interesting. The lighting looks realistic. You'll notice that like the different parts of the pizza are casting shadows. They all have interesting textures, and it looks pretty realistic. I'm going to show you how to create that. The very basic pizza we're going to make today is going to be a little bit more simple. It's going to look like this when you're done. But this is the starting step, and this is where I need you to get before the next class. So you'll notice if you look at my pizza here that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 separate layers plus the background. Each layer has its own stuff on it, okay? So I have one layer that is just the crust. I have one layer that's just the sauce. I have one layer that's just the cheese. And I have one layer that's just the pepperoni, okay? So it is a separate layer for each element of the pizza, okay? The reason that we draw pizza, there's a number of reasons, but number one is it's mostly circles, which makes it really easy to draw. Secondly, pizza is naturally made up of layers. So I have separate layers for each of the separate parts or components of my pizza. It makes a lot of sense, okay? So I'm gonna start it from scratch. Here is how we do it. Homemade pizza from scratch. How about it? I'm gonna click new project, and I'm just gonna title it pizza, and I'm gonna make it 1500 by 1500 pixels, okay? Click create, and there is my square. So in order to start making my pizza, the first thing I'm gonna do is make a new layer. So this is a separate layer from the background. I'm going to make sure I'm on that new layer, okay? I'm going to grab my brush tool, and I'm going to pick a color for my pizza crust. So a good color for a pizza crust would be sort of a brownish, sort of a lightish tan brown kind of color. So I'm going to go somewhere down here between yellow and orange, and then I'm going to pick my color somewhere in this neighborhood like that. Let me test it out. That's a pretty good color for a pizza crust. You be your own judge. You decide what you want. For my crust, I want my hardness to be turned up all the way to 100%, and I want the size of my crust to be exactly 1200 pixels. So I can actually type a number in there, and it'll make that my brush that exact size. So that is a 1200 pixel pizza crust. Okay, so to make a perfect circle is very simple. You just make a large brush and just click one time. So there is my pizza crust, and it's a nice, perfect round circle. Okay, now I'm going to make a new layer. And for my second layer is going to be the sauce. I'm going to pick a saucy color. So in this case, I'm going to choose a sort of deep, dark, reddish, tomato-y kind of color, like that. That should work pretty well. Press OK, and there is my sauce color. Now, to make my sauce fit on top of my pizza, it cannot be the same size, okay, or it looks like that. Command Z to undo. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, okay? So ways to make my brush smaller. I can come up here to my brush menu and adjust it up there. I can change the number right here. I can also right-click, or on my Chromebook, that means click with 2 fingers. Okay, so as long as I have the brush tool selected, if I click with 2 fingers, it brings me that brush menu again. If I'm using a mouse, it's just a right click. If I'm using the touchpad, it's click with 2 fingers. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. So instead of 1200, I'm going to make it 1000. That's about that big. I'm going to actually make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to make it 1100, like so. That's a pretty good size. Okay, so now here is my sauce layer. Make sure it's on a separate layer. Cannot be on the same layer as the original pizza. So one layer for the crust, one layer for the sauce. I'm going to put it right in the middle as close as I can, and boom. So there's my sauce layer. okay? If it's not quite in the middle, I can move it around. My move tool is way up here at the top. It's this little arrow looking thing, and I can drag this around anywhere that I want. When I get it exactly in the middle, you'll see this little line appears. That line right there, that means that it's exactly in the center of the document, okay? If I click on my crust layer and move it, I can make sure it's also exactly in the center of my document. I can also move it up and down to make sure it's exactly in the middle, centered top and bottom as well. So right there, I know my crust and my sauce are centered perfectly. I could also use these buttons up here to center it, or I'm not going to do that right now. I could use this guy, right? Select multiple layers. It wants me to align these guys, so I could do it like that and like that. That also puts them exactly in the center. So there's my crust layer. There's my sauce layer. I'm going to make another layer, and this is going to be my cheese layer. I'm going to use this yellow color, but not quite. I'm going to make it a little bit more white, like that. And that will be my cheese layer. Take my brush. Again, make my brush a little bit smaller. In this case, around 1,000 pixels or so. Should be fine. Here is my cheese. Boom. I'm going to make another layer, and this layer is for my pepperoni. So I'm going to pick a nice pepperoni color, a little brighter than the sauce, actually a little darker than the sauce. It's kind of like that. Pepperoni is a lot smaller, obviously, so I'm going to shrink this down. So again, to change the size, I can click on my menu up here. I can right-click on my main document, or my favorite way, I can use the keyboard shortcut, which is the bracket keys. So when I press the bracket keys, they get smaller or bigger. If I press the left bracket, it makes my brush smaller. If I press the right bracket, it makes my brush bigger. What are the bracket keys? The bracket keys on your keyboard are the keys that look like this. That's your left bracket. That's your right bracket. And above it, it has the curly brackets like that. So those keys on your keyboard, which are right under your delete key, will make your brush smaller and bigger. Okay? Let's get rid of all that. So I'm going to pick a good size for my pepperoni. I would say something like that. Works pretty good. And now I'll start painting in my pepperoni. The trick to make pepperoni look correct on your pizza in this situation is place it kind of randomly, but you don't want any pepperonis that are touching each other like that. Okay, so we're trying to avoid that kind of look. Kind of messes things up later on when we apply our effects. So for right now, something like that, that should be okay. So I have pepperoni, I have cheese, I have sauce, and I have crust. Now, at the moment, it doesn't really look all that realistic, and the problem is it looks too perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my eraser tool over here. This is the eraser. Okay, I'm going to pick an eraser size about like that or so. I'm going to pay very close attention to my layers, and I've never seen a pizza that has sauce that's that perfect. Maybe at Domino's, maybe, but I don't want it to look so perfect. So I'm going to come in here with my eraser, and I'm going to just make my sauce look a little bit more random, a little bit more natural. So this makes it look more like someone has actually, spooned this onto the crust rather than making it look like it's a perfect, 100%. Perfect circle. In the real world, things tend not to be so perfect. So if I go in here with this eraser and make it a little bit more random, looks a little bit more natural. I'm going to do the same thing on my cheese layer. You'll notice the eraser only works on the layer that you have selected. So if I want to erase one of my pepperonis, I need to make sure I'm on the pepperoni layer. If I'm erasing the crust, I need to make sure I'm on the crust layer. In this case, I'm erasing the cheese, so I'm on my cheese layer, layer 3. So I'm going to do the same thing with my cheese layer, just make it look a little bit more natural, not quite so perfect. So I'm just going in with the eraser very quickly here and making the edge look a little bit more rough. Okay. I think that will about do it. Okay. So now I've got a fairly realistic looking sauce to cheese ratio, as well as having some pepperonis and sauce and crust. If you've done this correctly, you're going to have a separate layer for each component of your pizza. If you notice that two of your layers are combined, like I just combined those two layers, I now have my cheese and my pepperoni on the same layer. That's a big no-no, and that's going to cause problems down the road. So if you've done that, you're going to want to go ahead and just delete that layer, remake it again, and make a separate layer for each component. So it really does need to look like this. One layer for pepperoni, one layer for cheese, one layer for sauce, one layer for crust. If you've done all that, congratulations, you've done it successfully. At this point, I'm going to go File and choose Save as PSD. PSD is a Photoshop document. A PSD file is going to save all my layers. It's going to be really nice and usable, and I'm going to be able to open it again later. Once I've saved it, I'm good, and I'm done. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Send me any questions that you might have. You can also, well, I don't want them in any chat, but if you have any questions, send me an email, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. Thanks, and good luck.